September 1st, 1592. The Battle of Pyongyang. After our victory at Hansan Island, the word of Admiral Yi Sun-sin's triumph spread through the land, igniting a flame of hope in the hearts of our people. But the war was far from over. While we found success at sea, the Japanese continued their relentless march inland. The capital was lost, and our forces were scattered. Yet we regrouped, and the command was clear. We would take back Pyongyang, the great northern city, and deliver a blow to the invaders that they would never forget. I arrived in Pyongyang alongside the combined forces of Joseon and our Ming allies from China. The sight of the city from the distance was both familiar and foreign. It had once been a symbol of our strength, but now it lay under the control of the enemy. The Japanese had fortified their position there, turning the city into a stronghold. General Kim Myong-won led our Joseon forces, while Ming reinforcements, led by General Zhu Chengshun, bolstered our strength. It was the largest army I had seen in this war, a coalition of tens of thousands. The mood was tense, but there was a shared determination. We would take Pyongyang back, no matter the cost. The day was grey and cold, a sharp wind blowing in from the river. I stood in formation with my comrades, spear in hand, waiting for the signal to advance. The plan was simple but risky: surround the city, assault the gates, and force the Japanese into a corner. From our positions, we could see the walls of Pyongyang lined with enemy soldiers, their banners fluttering in the wind, muskets at the ready. This would not be an easy fight. The battle began with the sound of Ming artillery pounding the walls. The cannons roared, sending stones and debris flying through the air. The ground shook beneath my feet, and the echoes of the blasts rang in my ears. Our archers fired volleys into the sky, blackening the clouds with arrows as they rained down on the Japanese defenders. But the enemy was well prepared. Their musketeers fired in deadly volleys from behind the walls, and their archers returned fire with precision. The air was filled with the whistling of arrows and the crack of musket fire. Our infantry advanced, charging toward the city gates under the cover of the artillery. I ran with them, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt like a leap into death. I could hear the shouts of my comrades around me, the clatter of armor, the heavy breathing as we sprinted toward the gates. The Japanese fired down from the walls, and I saw men fall to the ground beside me, their bodies torn apart by musket balls and arrows. But there was no time to stop, no time to think. We had to keep moving. When we reached the base of the walls, the real fight began. The Japanese poured boiling oil down on us, and the screams of men being burned alive filled the air. They dropped rocks and spears, trying to break our assault. But we fought back. Ladders were raised, and our soldiers began to climb, desperate to breach the walls. I was one of them. I gripped the rungs of a ladder, my hands slick with sweat, and climbed as fast as I could. The fighting on the walls was brutal. I reached the top, just as one of the Japanese samurai came at me, his sword flashing in the dull light. I parried his blow with my spear, the force of it nearly knocking me off the wall. We traded blows in a flurry of steel and desperation. His skill was superior to mine, but I fought with everything I had. With a desperate thrust, I managed to drive my spear into his chest. He staggered back, falling from the wall into the chaos below. But there was no time to celebrate. The battle raged all around me. More of our soldiers climbed the walls, joining the fight. The Japanese fought fiercely, refusing to give an inch. I saw General Kim leading the charge below, urging our forces forward. The sound of battle was deafening. The clash of steel, the crack of muskets, the roar of cannons. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground was slick with blood. For hours, the battle hung in the balance. The Japanese defended every inch of the city, their resolve unshaken despite our overwhelming numbers. But slowly, we began to push them back. The Ming artillery had shattered sections of the walls, and through these breaches, our forces poured into the city. Street by street, house by house, we fought to reclaim Pyongyang. The Japanese set fire to buildings as they retreated, trying to deny us victory, but we pressed on. In the heart of the city, the fighting became even more savage. The streets were narrow, and the Japanese used every building, every alleyway as a point of defense. I found myself in a vicious hand-to-hand fight, surrounded by the smoke of burning homes and the cries of the wounded. My muscles ached, my vision blurred, but I fought on, driven by the thought of finally reclaiming our land. By nightfall, the Japanese were cornered, their last defenses crumbled, and we stormed their positions in the city center. They fought to the last man, their refusal to surrender a mark of their resolve. But in the end, they could not hold Pyongyang. When the final Japanese banner fell, the city was ours once again. I stood in the streets of Pyongyang, exhausted and bloodied, watching as the last of the fighting died down. The fires still burned, casting an eerie glow over the city. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. The cost had been too high. Too many of my comrades lay dead in the streets, and the city itself was a ruin. But we had done it. Pyongyang was back in Joseon hands. For the first time in months, we had reclaimed a piece of our homeland. October 5th, 1592, the Battle of Jinju, also known as the First Siege of Jinju. The autumn wind carried with it the scent of death. As we made our way toward Jinju Fortress, I couldn't shake the memories of Pyongyang from my mind. The scars of that battle were still fresh, the images of the broken city and the countless dead haunting me. But there was no time for rest. The Japanese had regrouped, and this time they were aiming to take the strategic fortress of Jinju. Jinju was more than just a fortress. It was a symbol of Joseon's resilience, standing tall on the southern frontier. If the Japanese captured Jinju, they would control the gateway to the southwestern provinces, a rich region that had remained largely untouched by the war. General Kim Si-min was in command of the fortress, and he had sworn that the Japanese would never breach its walls. We all knew this would be a brutal fight, one that could decide the fate of the war in the south. The Japanese arrived with an overwhelming force. Their general, Konishi Yukinaga, led an army of nearly 30,000 men. They came prepared, bringing siege weapons, muskets, and an iron will to conquer. Inside Jinju's walls, we were fewer than 4,000, a mix of soldiers, monks, and civilians determined to defend the fortress. We had the advantage of the high ground, and the walls of Jinju were thick and strong, but we were outnumbered, nearly 10 to 1. I stood among the ranks of the defenders, looking out from the walls as the Japanese army approached like a rolling wave. Their banners filled the horizon, and the sound of their war drums sent a chill down my spine. General Kim moved among us, his voice calm, encouraging us to stand firm. He reminded us that Jinju had never fallen to an enemy, and it would not fall today. The first assault came at dawn. The Japanese brought forward their musketeers, forming lines at the base of the fortress walls. The crack of their gunfire was like thunder, and bullets ricocheted off the stone walls, some finding their mark among our men. But Jinju's walls were high, and their musket fire could not reach us effectively. From above, we rained arrows and stones down on them, forcing them back. Then came their ladders. Dozens of them appeared all at once, slamming against the walls. The Japanese soldiers began to climb, their swords and spears gleaming in the morning light. I was stationed near the western gate, where the fighting was fiercest. We worked together, pushing the ladders back down, pouring boiling oil over the attackers, and shooting arrows into the swarming mass below. The air was thick with the stench of burning oil and blood. For hours, the Japanese threw everything they had at us. Their muskets fired continuously, and their soldiers charged relentlessly, but we held the walls. General Kim's strategy was brilliant. He had positioned archers in hidden posts along the walls, and they picked off the Japanese officers, creating confusion in their ranks. He had also prepared large boulders to be rolled down the slopes, crushing any who dared approach too close. By midday, the Japanese had pulled back, regrouping for another assault. The brief respite allowed us to catch our breath. I looked around at my comrades, exhausted, bloodied, but still standing. The walls of Jinju were stained red, and the ground below was littered with the bodies of Japanese soldiers. But we knew the enemy wasn't done yet. The second wave came in the afternoon. This time, they brought siege towers, massive wooden constructs designed to scale the walls. As they rolled them forward, I could see the determination in the faces of the Japanese soldiers. They believed Jinju would fall today, but we were ready. As soon as the towers reached the walls, we unleashed our secret weapon, hwachas. The hwachas were devastating. Each one fired hundreds of arrow-like projectiles, raining death upon the advancing Japanese. The air was filled with the whistling of arrows and the screams of the wounded. I watched as entire units were torn apart, the siege towers catching fire from the onslaught. The Japanese soldiers who had survived the initial barrage were cut down by our spears and swords as they tried to climb the walls. But they kept coming. The battle stretched into the night. The Japanese attempted to breach the gates using battering rams, but we repelled them with everything we had: fire, arrows, stones, even our bare hands when necessary. It was as if the entire population of Jinju was fighting to protect the city. Even women and children carried stones to the walls, doing whatever they could to help. The spirit of the city was unbreakable. I remember a moment, just before dawn, when I thought the walls might finally give. The Japanese had focused all their efforts on one section, and the stone began to crumble under the constant barrage of musket fire and cannon shots. I was called to reinforce the breach, along with every available man. We fought in a frenzy, holding the line as best we could. My arms were numb from swinging my spear, my vision blurred from the blood and smoke. But then, just as it seemed the Japanese might break through, a loud horn sounded from their camp. They were retreating. I collapsed against the wall, unable to believe it. We had done it. The Japanese had withdrawn, their army shattered against the walls of Jinju. The fortress had held. General Kim had kept his promise. As the sun rose, I looked out over the battlefield. The land around Jinju was a graveyard of fallen soldiers, and the smell of death lingered in the air. But we had survived. The fortress, the city, and the people of Joseon had endured. The Battle of Jinju was a victory, one that would be remembered for generations. But as I sat there, exhausted and bloodied, I knew that this war was far from over. The Japanese would return, and when they did, we would be ready to fight them again, just as fiercely as we had fought today. October 26th, 1592. The Battle of Haengju. After the triumph at Jinju, hope spread through the ranks of our forces, but there was little time to celebrate. The Japanese, humiliated by their defeat at the fortress, retaliated swiftly. Their strategy shifted, no longer focused only on capturing strongholds, but now intent on crushing us by sheer force of numbers and cutting off our remaining defenses. I was stationed with a smaller detachment at Jinju Fortress, a hilltop fort just outside Hanyang, modern-day Seoul. Our commander, General Gwon Yul, had been tasked with defending this strategic position. While Haengju was not as imposing as Jinju, its high ground offered a vital advantage. However, our numbers were small, barely 3,000 men, including a mix of regular soldiers, monks, and local peasants. We were vastly outnumbered by the approaching Japanese force, said to be 30,000 strong. The tension was palpable as the Japanese approached. Word had spread of their brutality, and none of us were strangers to the horrors of this war. But despite the odds, General Gwon Yul radiated a calm confidence. He had devised a plan to use the natural defenses of the fortress, the terrain, and the limited weaponry we had at our disposal, particularly the hwachas, the same rocket-powered arrow launchers that had turned the tide at Jinju. In the early morning, the sound of the enemy drums echoed through the hills. The sight of the Japanese forces stretching out before us was overwhelming, their banners flying in the wind like a sea of red and black. They marched in perfect formation, their muskets gleaming in the sunlight, and their cannons rolling forward with grim purpose. The first wave of the assault began before we were fully prepared. The Japanese charged up the hill, shouting war cries, their musketeers firing at us as they advanced. I took cover behind the wooden barricades, arrows already whizzing past my head. From my position on the wall, I could see them climbing the steep slope toward the fortress, their swords drawn, ready to scale the walls. Then came the order from General Gwon Yul: unleash the hwachas. I had witnessed their destructive power at Jinju, but nothing could have prepared me for the devastation that followed. The hwachas roared like thunder, their arrows flying in dense clouds toward the advancing Japanese. It was as if the sky itself was raining death. I saw entire lines of soldiers fall, their bodies riddled with arrows before they even reached the gates. The Japanese soldiers hesitated, their advance momentarily halted by the sheer ferocity of our defense. But they did not retreat. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers came at us. I watched as they brought their scaling ladders and battering rams to the walls. Despite our best efforts, some managed to breach the outer defenses, and the fighting became hand-to-hand. I found myself standing side by side with farmers wielding makeshift spears, and monks swinging long wooden poles, their faces set with grim determination. The Japanese samurai were relentless. I remember one man in particular, dressed in full armor, his katana flashing as he cut down two of my comrades. He charged at me, and in that moment, I thought my time had come. I parried his first strike with my spear, but his strength was overwhelming. With a quick twist, he disarmed me, knocking the spear from my hands. In desperation, I grabbed a nearby stone and hurled it at him. The the impact staggering him long enough for one of my fellow soldiers to strike him down. The battle raged on for hours, the walls of Haengju turning into a hellish landscape of blood, smoke, and fire. The Japanese tried to bring up cannons to batter the walls, but the steep slopes made it difficult for them to position their artillery. Meanwhile, our archers rained arrows down upon them, and our spearmen held the gates with sheer willpower. Then, when it seemed like the Japanese might overwhelm us, General Gwon Yul ordered another Hwacha barrage. The timing was perfect. The enemy, packed tightly near the walls, had no escape. The Hwachas unleashed their deadly rain once more, and the carnage was unimaginable. The Japanese lines broke as men scrambled to escape the onslaught. Those who didn't fall to the arrows were cut down as they retreated, their ranks in disarray. As the sun began to set, the Japanese commanders sounded the retreat. I stood on the walls, barely able to believe what had happened. We had done it. Against all odds, we had held Haengju. The field below was littered with the dead and dying. The Japanese had left hundreds of their men behind, their bodies sprawled across the slopes like fallen leaves in autumn. It was a sight I will never forget. The smell of blood and gunpowder hanging thick in the air, the groans of the wounded rising like a mournful chorus from below. Though we had won the day, it came at a heavy cost. Many of my comrades lay dead or dying, their bodies piled against the walls they had fought so hard to defend. I sat on the ground, exhausted, my hands shaking from the hours of combat. The faces of the fallen haunted me, but there was no time to grieve. We knew the Japanese would return, and when they did, they would come with even greater force. Yet, for now, Haengju stood strong. General Gwon Yul's leadership had saved us, and the fortress remained a beacon of hope for Joseon. The victory at Haengju was more than just a military triumph. It was a symbol that, no matter how many times the Japanese attacked, no matter how powerful they seemed, we would not break. The war was not yet over, but on this day, we had won a battle that would be remembered for generations.